Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Robert Augustine Ward Lowndes, September 4th, 1916 to 14 July 1998, was an American editor and author, and a correspondent of H.P. Lovecraft in the last year of the latter's life. An avid horror fan, he wrote a number of pieces both set in and inspired by the Cthulhu Mythos. This collection has 4 short stories and a poem. I added chapters for each story. Hope you enjoy this video. The Abyss by Robert W. Lowndes. Stirring Science Stories, February 1941. We took Graf Norden's body out into the November night, under the stars that burned with a brightness terrible to behold, and drove madly, wildly up the mountain road. The body had to be destroyed because of the eyes that would not close, but seemed to be staring at some object behind the observer, the body that was entirely drained of blood without the slightest trace of a wound. The body whose flesh was covered with abhorrent, luminous markings, designs that shifted and changed form before one's eyes. We wedged what had been Graf Norden tightly behind the wheel, put a makeshift fuse in the gas tank, lit it, then shoved the car over the side of the road, where it plummeted down to the main highway, a flaming meteor. Not until the next day did we realize that we had all been under Durin's spell. Even I had forgotten. How else could we have rushed out so eagerly, leaving him to gloat over his triumph? From that terrible moment when the lights came on again, and we saw the thing that had, a moment before, been Graf Norden, we were as shadowy, indistinct figures rushing through a dream. All was forgotten save the unspoken commands upon us, as we watched the blazing car strike the pavement below, observed its demolition, then tramped dully each to his own home. When, the next day, partial memory returned to us and we sought Durin, he was gone. And, because we valued our freedom, we did not tell anyone what had happened, nor try to discover whence Durin had vanished. We wanted only to forget. I think I might possibly have forgotten had I not looked into the Song of Yste again. With the others, there has been a growing tendency to treat it all as illusion, but I cannot. I have learned a small part of reality, for it is one thing to read of books like the Necronomicon, Book of Ibon, or Song of Yste, but it is quite different when one's own experience confirms some of the dread things related therein. Many have read excerpts from the Necronomicon, yet are reassured by the thought that Alhazred was mad. What if they were to discover that, far from being mad, Abdul-Alhazred was so terribly sane that others dubbed him mad simply because they could not bear the burden of the facts he uncovered? Of such truths, I found one paragraph in the Song of Yste, and have not read farther. The dark volume, along with Norden's other books, is still on my shelves. I have not burned it, but I do not think that I shall read more. But let me tell you of Durin and Graf Norden, for around these two lie the reasons for my reluctance for the further pursuance of my studies. I met Graf Norden at Dulwich University in Dr. Held's class in medieval and early Renaissance history, which was more a study of obscure thought and often outright occultism. Norden was greatly interested. He had done quite a bit of exploring into the occult. In particular was he fascinated by the writings and records of a family of adepts named Durka, who traced their ancestry back to the pre-glacial days. They, the Durkas, had translated the Song of Yste from its legendary form into the 3 great languages of the Dawn cultures, then into the Greek Latin, Arabic and finally, Elizabethan English. I told Norden that I deplored the blind contempt in which the world holds the occult, but had never explored the subject very deeply. I was content to be a spectator, letting my imagination drift at will upon the many currents in this dark river. Skimming over the surface was enough for me. Seldom did I take occasional plunges into the deeps. As a poet and dreamer, I was careful not to lose myself in the blackness of the pools where I disported. One could always emerge to find a calm blue sky and a world that thought nothing of these realities. With Norden, it was different. He was already beginning to have doubts, he told me. It was not an easy road to travel. There were hideous dangers, hidden all along the way, often so that the wayfarer was not aware of them until too late. Earthmen were not very far along the path of evolution. Still very young, their lack of knowledge, as a race, told heavily against such few of their number who sought to traverse unknown roads. He spoke of messengers from beyond, and made references to obscure passages in the Necronomicon and Song of Yste. He spoke of alien beings, entities terribly unhuman, impossible of measurement by any human yardstick, or to be combated effectively by mankind. Doreen came into the picture at about this time. He walked into the classroom one day during the course of a lecture. Later, Dr. Held introduced him as a new member of the class, coming from abroad. There was something about Doreen that challenged my interest at once. I could not determine of what race or nationality he might be. He was very close to being beautiful, his every movement being of grace and rhythm. Yet, in no way could he be considered effeminate. He was, in a word, superb. That the majority of us avoided him troubled him not at all. For my part, he did not seem genuine, but with the others, it was probably his utter lack of emotion. There was, for example, the time in the lab when a test tube burst in his face, driving several splinters deep into the skin. He showed not the slightest sign of discomfort, waved aside all expressions of solicitude on the part of some of the girls, and proceeded to go on with his experiment as soon as the medico had finished with him. The final act started when we were dealing with hypnotism one afternoon and were discussing the practical possibilities of the subject, following up the Rhine experiments and others. Colby presented a most ingenious argument against it, ridiculed the association of experiments in thought transference or telepathy with hypnotism, and arrived at a final conclusion that hypnotism, outside of mechanical means of induction, was impossible. It was at this point that Doreen spoke up. What he said, I cannot now recall, but it ended in a direct challenge for Doreen to prove his statements. Norden said nothing during the course of this debate. He appeared somewhat pale, and was, I noticed, trying to flash a warning signal to Colby. My frank opinion now is that Doreen had planned evoking this challenge. At the time, however, it seemed spontaneous enough. There were 5 of us over at Norden's place that night. Granville, Chalmers, Colby, Norden, and myself. Norden was smoking endless cigarettes, gnawing his nails and muttering to himself. I suspected something irregular was up, but what? I had no idea. Then Doreen came in, and the conversation, such as it had been, ended. Colby repeated his challenge, saying he had brought along the others as witnesses to ensure against being tricked by stage devices. No mirrors, lights, or any other mechanical means of inducing hypnosis would be permitted. It must be entirely a matter of wills. Doreen nodded, drew the shade, then turned, directing his gaze at Colby. We watched, expecting him to make motions with his hands and pronounce commands. He did neither. He fixed his eyes upon Colby, and the latter stiffened as if struck by lightning, then, eyes staring blankly ahead of him. He rose slowly, standing on the narrow strip of black that ran diagonally down through the center of the rug. My mind ran back to the day I caught Norden in the act of destroying some papers and apparatus, the latter which had been constructed, with such assistance as I had been able to give, over a period of several months. His eyes were terrible, and I could see doubt in them. Not long after this event, Doreen had made his appearance. Could there have been a connection, I wondered? My reverie was broken abruptly by the sound of Doreen's voice commanding Colby to speak, telling us where he was and what he saw around him. When Colby obeyed, it was as if his voice came to us from a distance. He was standing, he said, on a narrow bridgeway overlooking a frightful abyss, so vast and deep that he could discern neither floor nor boundary. Behind him this bridgeway stretched until it was lost in a bluish haze. Ahead, it ran toward what appeared to be a plateau. He hesitated to move because of the narrowness of the path, yet realized that he must make for the plateau before the very sight of the depths below him made him lose his balance. He felt strangely heavy, and speaking was an effort. As Colby's voice ceased, we all gazed in fascination at the little strip of black in the blue rug. This then was the bridge over the abyss, but what could correspond to the illusion of depth? Why did his voice seem so far away? Why did he feel heavy? The plateau must be the workbench at the other end of the room. The rug ran up to a sort of dais upon which was set Norden's table, the surface of this being some 7 feet above the floor. Colby now began to walk slowly down the black swath, moving as if with extreme caution, looking like a slow-motion camera shot. His limbs appeared weighted. He was breathing rapidly. Doreen now bade him halt, and looked down into the abyss carefully, telling us what he saw there. At this, we again examined the rug, as if we had never seen it before, and did not know that it was entirely without decoration save for that single black strip upon which Colby now stood. His voice came to us again. He said, at first, that he saw nothing in the abyss below him. Then he gasped, swayed, and almost lost his balance. We could see the sweat standing out on his brow and neck, soaking his blue shirt. There were things in the abyss, he said in hoarse tones, great shapes that were like blobs of utter blackness, yet which he knew to be alive. From the central masses of their beings, he could see them shoot forth incredibly long filamentine tentacles. They moved themselves forward and backward, horizontally, but could not move vertically, it seemed. They were, he thought, nothing but living shadows. But the things were not all on the same plane. True, their movements were only horizontal in relation to their position, but some were parallel to him and some diagonal. Far away he could see things perpendicular to him. There appeared now to be a great deal more of the things than he had thought. The first ones he had seen were far below, unaware of his presence, but these sensed him and were trying to reach him. He was moving faster now, he said, but to us he was still walking in slow motion. I glanced sidewise at Norden. He too was sweating profusely. He arose now and went over to Doreen, speaking in low tones so that none of us could hear. I knew that he was referring to Colby and that Doreen was refusing whatever it was Norden demanded. Then Doreen was forgotten momentarily as Colby's voice came to us again, quivering with fright. The things were reaching out for him. They rose and fell on all sides, some far away, some hideously close. None had found the exact plane upon which he could be captured. The darting tentacles had not touched him, but all of the beings now sensed his presence. He was sure. And he feared that perhaps they could alter their planes at will, though it appeared that they must do so blindly, seemingly like two-dimensional beings. The tentacles darting at him were threads of utter darkness. A terrible suspicion arose in me as I recalled some of the earlier conversations with Norden and remembered certain passages from the Song of Yste. I tried to rise, but my limbs were powerless. I could only sit helplessly and watch. Norden was still speaking with Doreen, and I saw that he was now very pale. He seemed to shrink away. Then he turned and went over to a cabinet, took out some object and came to the strip of rug upon which Colby was standing. Norden nodded to Doreen, and now I saw what it was he held in his hand, a polyhedron of glassy appearance. There was in it, however, a glow that startled me. Desperately I tried to remember the significance of it, for I knew, but my thoughts were being short-circuited, it seemed, and when Doreen's eyes rested upon me, the very room seemed to stagger. Again Colby's voice came through, this time despairingly. He was afraid he would never reach the plateau. Actually, he was about 1.5 yards away from the end of the black strip and the dais upon which stood Norden's workbench. The things, said Colby, were close now, A mass of thread-like tentacles had just missed him. Now Norden's voice came to us. It too, seemingly far away. He called my name. This was more, he said, than mere hypnotism. It was. But then his voice faded, and I felt the power of Durin blanking out the sound of his words. Now and then, I would hear a sentence or a few disjointed words, but from this I managed to get an inkling of what was going on. This was not mere hypnotism, but actually trans-dimensional journeying. We just imagined we saw Norden and Colby standing on the rug, or perhaps it was through Durin's influence. The nameless dimension was the habitat of these shadow beings. The abyss and the bridge upon which the two stood were illusions created by Durin. When that which Durin had planned was complete, our minds would be probed and our memories treated, so that we recalled no more than Durin wished us to remember. He, Durin, was a being of incredible power, who was using Colby and the rest of us for a nameless purpose. Norden had succeeded in forcing an agreement upon Durin, one which he would have to keep. As a result, if the two could reach the plateau before the shadow beings touched them, all would be well. If not, Norden did not specify, but indicated that they were being hunted as men hunt game. The polyhedron contained an element repulsive to the things. He was but a little behind Colby. We could see him aiming with the polyhedron. Colby spoke again, telling us that Norden had materialized behind him and had brought some sort of weapon with which the things could be held off. Then Norden called my name, asking me to take care of his belongings if he did not return, telling me to look up the Adumbrali in the Song of Yste. Slowly, he and Colby made their way toward the dais and the table. Colby was but a few steps ahead of Norden. Now he climbed upon the dais and, with the others' help, made his way onto the bench. He tried to assist Norden, but as the latter mounted the dais, he stiffened suddenly and the polyhedron fell from his hands. Frantically, he tried to draw himself up, but he was being forced backward, and I knew that he had lost. There came to us a single cry of anguish. Then the lights in the room faded and went out. Whatever spell had been upon us now was removed. We rushed about like madmen, trying to find Norden, Colby, and the light switch. Then suddenly the lights were on again, and we saw Colby sitting dazedly on the bench, while Norden lay on the floor. Chalmers bent over the body in an effort to resuscitate him, but when he saw the condition of Norden's remains, he became so hysterical that we had to knock him cold in order to quiet him. Colby followed us mechanically, apparently unaware of what was happening. We took Graf Norden's body out into the November night and destroyed it by fire, telling Colby later that he had apparently suffered a heart attack while driving up the mountain road. The car had gone over, and his body was almost completely destroyed in the Holocaust. Later, Chalmers, Granville and I met in an effort to rationalize what we had seen and heard. Chalmers had been all right after he came around, had helped us with our grisly errand up the mountain road. Neither, I found, had heard Norden's voice after he had joined Colby in the supposed hypnotic stage. So, it was as I thought. Durin's power had blanked out the sound of Norden's voice for them completely. Nor did they recall seeing any object in Norden's hand. But, in less than a week, even these memories had faded from them. They fully believed that Norden had died in an accident after an unsuccessful attempt on the part of Durin to hypnotize Colby. Prior to this, their explanation had been that Durin had killed Norden for reasons unknown, and that we had been his unwitting accomplices. The hypnotic experiment had been a blind to gather us all together and provide a means of disposing of the body. That Durin had been able to hypnotize us, they did not doubt then. The illusion of the abyss, they said, was just a cruel joke. It is no use telling them what I learned a few days later, what I learned from Norden's notes which explain Durin's arrival, or to quote sections from the Song of Yste to them. Yet, I must set these things down. In that accursed book is a section dealing with an utterly alien race of entities known as the Adumbrali. and these be none other than the Adumbrali, the living shadows, beings of incredible power and malignancy, which dwell without the veils of space and time such as we know it. Their sport it is to import into their realm the inhabitants of other dimensions, upon whom they practice horrid pranks and manifold illusions. But more dreadful than these are the seekers which they send out into other worlds and dimensions, beings of incredible power which they themselves have created and guised in the form of those who dwell within whatever dimension, or upon whichever worlds where these seekers be sent. These seekers can be detected only by the adept, to whose trained eyes their too perfectness of form and movement, their strangeness and aura of alienage and power is a sure sign. The sage, Chalcanan, tells of one of these seekers who deluded 7 priests of Nyaghoggua into challenging it to a duel of the hypnotic arts. He further tells how 2 of these were trapped and delivered to the Adumbrali, their bodies being returned when the shadow things are done with them. Most curious of all was the condition of the corpses, being entirely drained of all fluid, yet showing no trace of a wound, even the most slight. But the crowning horror was the eyes, which could not be closed, appearing to stare restlessly outward beyond the observer, and the strangely luminous markings on the dead flesh, curious designs which appeared to move and change form before the eyes of the beholder. End of the Abyss by Robert W. Lowndes. Nyaghoggua by Robert W. Lowndes. Famous Fantastic Mysteries, April 1941. Deep in the heart of time it lies supreme, and hideous in dread malignancy, replete with galaxies devoured. The kraken within, Nyaghoggua, some who dream. Not wisely, seek, not by the paths of sleep. Yugoth and Sarusin, or lost Stani, and far-flung, shadowed Lanth. The Upiaz tree, gigantic and infernal, or the deep. Horrific realms of Really will find, too late. Ofttimes the veil of outer space is worn. Great rifts occur, and through the strangely torn, gouged walls, appear its servitors that wait. Under the rim of space, they come, and then are weird rites practiced on what once were men. The Leapers by Robert W. Lowndes as Carol Gray. Future Fantasy and Science Fiction, December 1942. A complete novelette of bitter, fantastic conflict for the possession of the earth and its peoples. The avid followers of daily papers may have noted some weeks ago a small item that appeared in nearly all of the metropolitan afternoon editions, and, in some instances, was recounted on radio news reviews. In some cases, I believe it was carried over for the rest of that day's editions. In all papers, the headlines were virtually the same, as was the wording of the story proper. Iron shoes will repel lunar drag, says Brooklyn scholar. Brooklyn, New York, July 5. Arthur Clarkson of 1746 Bradford Drive, Brooklyn, is sure that the moon is responsible for more than light-headedness. Clarkson stated yesterday that Earth's satellite has taken to negating terrestrial gravitation and attracting living beings to its surface. Clarkson further stated that he personally had come under the baleful influence of the full moon, and avers that only quick thinking saved him from being drawn irresistibly upward. I filled my shoes with iron, affirmed Clarkson, and what is more, I'm having a special pair made. There's something going on, and I'm not going to be caught unawares. When asked about the reason for the moon's untoward behavior, Clarkson shrugged his shoulders. I'm a student of occult sciences, he explained, but I never came across anything like this. You'll have to ask the astronomers, he added. But you can bet that from now on I'm wearing these iron-soled shoes whenever the full moon is out. It is further worth noting that an especially long list of missing persons was read over radio station WNYC on July 4th and 5th. The reading took more than twice the amount of time customarily devoted to this service and cut in on a special music program scheduled to follow. Some of the names read were, of course, carryovers, but an amazingly large number of persons disappeared on or around the night of July 4th. On the night of July 4th, the moon was full. Outstanding was the fact that nearly all who disappeared from the city of New York at this time were between the ages of 22 and 30, in good health, of more than average intelligence, and proficient in some form of the arts. With the exception of a newlywed couple, all were single and engaged in a form of literary or artistic creation that required a highly imaginative cast of mind. One of the missing, for example, was an attractive blonde of 23, widely renowned among the devotees of the more imaginative and speculative pulp fiction as an illustrator. Another, a man of 27, was in the process of becoming a favorite in the field of fantastic cosmic horror fiction, the general type of narrative wherein Poe, Machen, and Lovecraft specialized. None of the missing, apparently, had had any premonition of their impending fate. None left behind any clue as to the nature of their vanishing, nor has any word subsequently been heard from them. Recently, I spoke with an old acquaintance who had just left the care of a physician at a hospital for the insane. Furthermore, I have re-engaged in the study of a certain volume whose name is well known to lovers of the weird and fantastic. No, I have not burned this tome now that my studies are complete, but if at any time it was my opinion that such studies are to be undertaken only by those well fortified in their mental outlook, that opinion has been strengthened into a positive conviction. The incident that resulted in my decision to investigate more fully the happenings of the night of July 4th took place by sheer chance on the afternoon of July 7th. I was conversing at that time with a friend in the 42nd Street cafeteria, idling over tall glasses of iced tea. A traffic officer, off duty, chose the table at which we were sitting and proceeded to take an old newspaper from his pocket, which he looked over with considerable puzzlement. Then, becoming aware of its date, he laid it on the table with a look of chagrin. Oddly enough, it was open to the very page that gave the news release I have already reproduced above. I glanced at my companion, indicating the paper, and asked if he had seen this item. Upon noting our interest in the item, the officer leaned forward confidentially. "You know," he said to us, "I came across something a lot like that the other night. I guess it was the same night." July 4th. "You met someone with these same delusions?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not exactly the same, but a lot like it. He was drunk, so I just helped him to a train. He claimed he saw people flying around the News and Channing buildings. They didn't have any wings. They were just jumping up into the air. He says he looked up suddenly, and there they were leaping from the windows of one of the buildings. He was plenty scared, he says, but in an instant he saw that they weren't falling. They were soaring up. Like you do in dreams when you start jumping down a long flight of stairs and find yourself floating." "Could he make any of them out?" asked my companion. He said they were all young people, some girls too. "One was a pretty blonde," he said. "They kept on soaring higher and higher until they were out of sight." Oh, I know he was drunk and seeing his own brand of pink elephants, but that story in the paper made me think of it. Funny how these delusions seem to run in batches, isn't it? Extract from an article in the Solitarian, official organ of the initiates of the fourth orbit, dated August 1941. "Thus can there be no doubt but that the truce remains in effect only so long as the balance of power between R and the Y is maintained. But let this balance shift even for an instant, and the struggle re-ensues, for timeless are the contestants. Yet mightier still than the contestants is the cosmos, through which wheel unconcernedly states of existence beyond our comprehension, and beyond even their power to control or negate. And even as in the past it comes to pass in the realms of outer space, that which cannot but result in an eclipse of their control, so that for a period of great indefiniteness to man, albeit an instant to them. The veil is lifted. Then can we who are to surpass rejoice and be strong in our freedom, using it as a means to learn how this momentary whim of the cosmos can become at our hands as permanent a law as shall be permanent the race of man. The forbidden book need be forbidden no longer for the moment. Let it be studied by those who are prepared. Let it be searched diligently for that matter which they so dread our learning, that when the chance eclipse is past, we be not found in our former state of helplessness, but can be fully prepared to fulfill the destiny of and with that, the destiny of ourselves. This issue of the Solitarian was supplied to me by a friend to whom I had mentioned the incident of July 4th. In a letter accompanying the magazine, he stated, "What Kay does not mention in his article is that the period of eclipse will find the human agents of them, as well as their messengers, more than ever active. In fact, since we do not know how long we have been in this period of relative momentary freedom, it is possible to theorize upon the state of the world today, and note what may be tokens of their interference. What, after all, has been the chief ban upon the forbidden book? The fear of what horrors might fall upon the student? No, certainly not that. Man has braved innumerable terrors before in his search for such knowledge as would give him mastery over the blind forces of this planet's nature. There has been a deeper, more insidious means of discouragement issuing forth from all manner of temporal authorities. In those days when the Church was the seat of human authority, the task of preventing the study of the forbidden book was simple. Those few who could not be frightened away by propaganda concerning the frightfulness of the song and the dire fate certain to befall any who dared read therein. A doom hideous beyond the most grisly punishments man-made law could impose. Those paltry few were easily either tracked down and obliterated, or kept so far underground as to make their success a mockery of its purpose. With the rise of new social and economic orders throughout our planet, this authority waned, yet it managed to impose its will nonetheless by controlling the sources of education. Far more clever than its dooms have been the authorities' campaign of classifying the forbidden knowledge with primal superstition, ignorance, and unscientific folly. No longer is it said, "Read the Song of Yste and nameless monsters will descend upon you," or "Read this blasphemous text and ye shall be damned." Now merely, study these things and the world will laugh at you for a fool and regard you as insane. This, my friend, is the most effective and dangerous weapon they have yet used. Still, I think it is clear that even so they do not feel secure. Perhaps they were aware of the coming of the eclipse, and surely they must have realized that even so artful a dodge as this last could not endure long. Every new social order brings with it a culture more fearless than that which crowned its preceding order. Every new social change bears with it a casting out of taboos and a re-examination of so-called self-evident or eternal truths. Thus, it could not be long before an awakened and united planet would decide that a thorough examination of the forbidden book be made. Not as directly as we would suggest it, but in an attempt to understand the past, and to see what kernels of new scientific discoveries might be found therein. Regardless of the precise manner and motive of this examination, it is clear that they dread it. Why, you may ask? It is quite obvious, my friend. The forbidden holds secrets which would enable mankind to attain heights they fear. Remember the Prometheus legends, which, in one form or another, can be found in every mythology. The gods saw in man that which would eventually surpass them, thus determined to keep man unaware of his power, and in a state of such relative helplessness that it could be hoped he would not long survive. Prometheus feared not man, but recognized that it was the law of all that is that some day the gods must be surpassed, so forbore to harm man, and sought rather to give him aid. Then the other gods made it unpleasant for him, Prometheus, but in no legend is it implied that they were able to kill him. They all have some form of improvement, with or without eternal torture. Some legends state frankly that someday Prometheus will free himself. and take sides against the gods in the final struggle ending in their being overthrown. Call Prometheus Loki. Call him, or rather, it, are, but the essential factors remain. The eternal flux of the cosmos decrees that nothing is eternal, that all that is constantly changes from one form to another, that each thing carries within itself the seed of its own surpassing. And recall that in all legends, the gods are supposed to have created man themselves, after their own fashion. In their own image is, I think, a bit too liberal and conducive to conclusions which do not follow. Consider then the struggle now taking place throughout the world. It is the struggle for a new state of man's being against which are lined every force which would, if permitted, put a halt to human progress. The clock, as the saying goes, would be turned back. Superstitions of all kinds would be reinstated. Culture as such would be stamped out, and further search into the nature of the cosmos prevented. What could be more desirable to them than the world triumph of these forces of barbarism, against which so many nations are pitted? It is my belief that a planet-wide network of their agents has long existed, and while it is not to be inferred that the conflict between the old and the new is entirely of their doing, yet there can be little doubt but that they have greatly augmented it and seek, by constant quantitative changes, to make of it an Armageddon which will completely wipe out the human race. Only after such an event can they feel safe, though, ironically enough, the extinction of man would not ensure their eternal safety at all. It might delay their surpassing, but would mean only that some form of being other than Homo sapiens would replace them. Yet, man is not to be considered entirely helpless against them and their agents. The titanic forces of Ar can be enlisted if only it can be reached and the truce ended. At the time this letter was received, I felt considerable dismay in that much of it was unintelligible to me, for I had been little more than a dilettante in my pursuance of the elder law. I had, in fact, read a few of the tales of classic horror, written some more or less precocious speculations regarding them, and written a letter or so to a muchly famed student residing in Providence, Rhode Island. He it was who had been the source of what little knowledge I possessed, and I had ceased my correspondence with him. Now, I could not be sure if he was still available at the old address. Something very akin to intuition told me that if anything was to be learned from an investigation, I must commence immediately. My first thought was to write to the author of the letter quoted above, frankly confessing my ignorance, placing such data as I had uncovered at his disposal. But a re-examination of this communication revealed a postscript I had overlooked, stating that he was embarking on an extensive journey the very next day. He made no mention of his purpose or destination. One road was already closed to me. The identity of Y and R puzzled me. That I should know them was more than evident. Obviously, the writer considered this knowledge so elementary that he did not bother to refer to the principals by other than their initials. The thing to do then, clearly, was to contact Jeffrey Barr, resume my correspondence. With this decision came a degree of caution. I would not at once bring up the subject dealt with in the other letter, but merely arouse his interest by sending him the newspaper clipping and recounting Traffic Officer Kern's testimony. Barr might be able to cast a good deal of light upon the phenomenon if it were, as I suspected, not an isolated occurrence, but merely an incident in a struggle as old as man. It was with more than a little excitement, therefore, that I opened a thick envelope some days later, addressed to me in Barr's minute handwriting. Chapter 2. Your letter was most welcome, I assure you, he began, not only because of the extremely interesting material you have found, but fully as much for its indirect admission that you have not as yet been swallowed up by any of the grisly horrors or fallen victim to more mundane dangers. Just why so many of my sporadic correspondents apparently become stricken with coyness in regard to writing me frequently, I have never been able to ascertain. I feel much like the cartoon comic strip villain, gotten up in generally repulsive attire, who leers down upon the quivering mass of feminine pulchritude that is the heroine, and snarls, "Why do you fear me, Nellie?" Only, "My dear fellow, even though I may not be as handsome to behold as yon villain, nor do I sport such glad rags, I never snarl at people, and am really as gentle-mannered an old codger as you could find anywhere. You would never suspect me of harboring dire secrets in the recesses of my cranium, but rather expect me to burst out with Ciceronian rhetoric upon little or no provocation, indulging in endless and learned exposition of the most dull and boring nature imaginable. Please humour me, therefore, and do not let so great a period of time pass before writing again. You strike me as being much like myself, in that you are much more facile, probably with the pen than in dealing with the spoken word at close range. Of course, nothing will ever be done in the way of genuine communication between humans until telepathy has been perfected and every person can transmit by merely signaling the brainwave of the party of the second part, and awaiting an all-clear signal. The phenomenon of July 4th I find of particular interest because it is in so many ways parallel to former occurrences. I'm enclosing a batch of clippings which you may keep if you like. I've had copies made of them, and these are carefully bound into my own books. However, if you have no use for them, I would prefer their return to their destruction. Some of them speak well enough for themselves, but a number require amplification and suitable allowances for journalistic distortions of the facts. I suggest we discuss them in order of date. The first, you see, is dated 1917. At that time, war news was the main interest of the day, so the incident was dismissed rather brusquely. However, I delved more deeply into the matter. Child's flight blocked by parents. Saybrook, Mass, November 3rd. Angela Ritchie, 9, of Vine Street, will not be allowed to do any more of this flying, say Mr. and Mrs. Carlo Ritchie. Neighbours have confirmed Mrs. Ritchie's contention that Angela had been jumping as high as 11 feet during the past few evenings. When questioned, Angela said she wanted to fly to the moon. Like Clara Scott, the child added, investigation disclosed that a Miss Clara Scott of Clarson Street had often shown interest in Angela. Clara said I could fly if I wanted to, insisted the child repeatedly. A physician recommended that Angela be watched carefully, but that no further reference to her flying be made. I chanced to be visiting friends near Saybrook at this time, continued Barr, and made a bit of an investigation of the matter myself, playing the role of an interested specialist, and perhaps misrepresenting myself somewhat. While I expected that the newspaper accounts would prove inadequate, I was not prepared for the amazing degree of indifference and sloth actually shown. It was necessary to sift out a good deal of superstition and general witchcraft theory from the data, but what I found was this. Angela had been observed leaping amazing heights and distances, just as in the account you sent me. She did not have to run any great distance, although a little sprinting did seem to help, but by merely standing still, the child managed to clear an easy 8 feet. Her weight at that time was a little more than normal. On the night of November 2nd, Clara Scott disappeared, and I believe has not been seen since. No immediate report of it was made, inasmuch as her uncle, with whom she lived, was engaged in illegal practices and did not dare call in the police. He told inquiring friends that she had gone away for a visit, but admitted to me, after I had produced the necessary money to make him talk, that she had flown away. The man was beside himself with terror, not only because of his dread of the law and being accused of a murder he did not commit, but also of being thought insane. Scott was no fool. He realized what would happen if he told the truth. The moon was full on November 2nd, Scott related, and he had gone up to the roof for a purpose he did not mention, nor did I inquire. He was astonished to see Clara standing near the edge of the roof at that time, her eyes apparently fixed upon the rising moon. She was rather flimsily dressed, and his first thought was that the girl, she was 22, might be walking in her sleep. He tried to creep up on her, but before he could do so, she suddenly leaped forward and upward. He says he cried out at that, expecting to see her fall to her death on the rock pile below, but she continued to soar upward, moving her arms slightly as if swimming, until she was out of sight. Angela Ricci's flying consisted, on the other hand, of mere leaps, although some thought they saw her moving her hands in mid-air, in the same manner as did the Scott girl. But Angela was prevented from leaping before the moon was fully risen. A few days later, her parents said, the girl had forgotten the entire incident completely. The next items were dated 1920. Secret weapon on the moon, says writer. Haverhill, Maine, August 9th. Claiming to have seen conclusive evidence of a secret weapon on the moon, Arthur Innes, amateur astronomer and feature writer, stated that he would shortly be sending a full account to the U.S. War Department. It's fantastic, he admitted soberly, but look at the utterly incredible things that have happened in the past. Look at aviation, a phenomenon which perfectly honest and capable mathematicians proved impossible. While I don't care to go in for speculation, he continued, I wouldn't be surprised if the Germans hadn't solved the secret of moon flight and were preparing bases for an attack upon the world. When asked by a reporter just how he thought the Germans could attack the United States from the moon, Innes grinned, then continued. It's not as impossible as it sounds, he said. Don't forget that the gravity is considerably lesser there. Earth could easily be bombarded from the moon. They would not need much bigger guns than they used to shell Paris or the British coast from across the Channel. I mention Germans rather than anyone else, he concluded, because history has shown that they are the ones with the ingenuity, perseverance, and fantastic ambition necessary to accomplish such a thing. But it could just as well be Martians. Are we being attacked from the moon? Editorial in the Dorcax Independent. Dorcax, Mass, September 11th. We have heard no further comment in the nation's press concerning the startling discoveries of Arthur Innes of Haverhill, Maine, who last month announced that full details of his observations were being sent to the War Department. If, as has been thought by many, Mr. Innes is no more than a crank and his alleged discoveries fraudulent, then the public deserves to know it. Yet let it not be said with any justice that we are a nation of stiff-necked scoffers. Mr. Innes's contentions are fantastic, as he himself admits, yet they deserve to be investigated. Had it been claimed some years before the event that our boys in France would be slaughtered with poison gas, loud would have been the cries that this was impossible. No nation would stoop to such inhuman methods of conducting warfare. Yet we have seen the well-nigh incredible fact, incredible in this seemingly advanced age, in addition to the unrestricted torpedoing of unarmed vessels, carrying no contraband of war. No, we very frankly are not tossing a wake of nights for fear of bombardment from the moon. We do not think it will happen. But we cannot so lightly dismiss what could well be a possibility, since a bit of vigilance could easily determine and resolve the matter. We feel the public has the right to hear the final word upon the subject from competent authorities. Is the neurotic influenced by full moon? Fairview, New Hampshire, September 17th. That the age-old theory of madmen and the psychologically unstable being influenced by the rays of the full moon is not entirely exploded superstition. Dr. Alan Joris of the Fairview Sanitarium revealed today. Dr. Joris based his statements upon the evidence of charts extending over the period of 4 years, showing the varying degrees of unrest experienced by a group of neurotics under his care. These people, Dr. Joris made clear, were not lunatics, but were psychologically unbalanced, undergoing treatment which would eventually return them to their homes, fully competent to deal with realities. The charts showed a marked increase of unrest and neurotic tendencies during the full moon period. At this period, Dr. Joris stated, there were several who showed signs of definite delusions, generally centering around a desire to fly to the moon and a belief that they could leap off the earth when the moon was high and be carried upwards by some agency they could not name. After the full moon period waned, they returned to normal and usually had little or no recollection of their actions and expressions. I could not obtain much information from these three sources stated bar. Arthur Innes, to whom I wrote immediately, made no reply, and after a few months, further letters were returned marked removed, left no address. However, a Mr. Julian Klein, attached to the staff of the Dorcas Independent, told me in an interview that his editorial was partly based upon stories of mysterious disappearances around the time that Innes' first statement appeared. To go into details would be repetitious. They merely duplicated the phenomenon of July 4th and 5th of this year. I looked into these cases myself and confirmed that 5 men, 4 women and several children vanished at around this time. I managed to get definite claims of their having been seen leaping great distances from various parties. There seemed to be a definite reluctance to impart information, and inasmuch as my health was not good at the time, I was unable to make as full an inquiry as I should have liked. Particularly strange, however, was the disappearance of Innes, for I obtained several contradictory stories concerning it. He seems to have told some acquaintances of his intention to investigate the moon plot, as he termed it firsthand, although at no time did he say anything about an interplanetary vehicle of any type. But one neighbor of Innes admitted to having seen an object in the sky on a certain night when the moon was full. It was moving away from the earth and soon became indistinguishable. He went into the house and got a pair of glasses, but was unable to find the object thereafter. He could not give a clear description of it, but said that it might have been a man, inasmuch as his first impression was that of a man falling. As he watched, waiting to see if a parachute would appear, it grew smaller rather than larger, and he realized at that point that it was departing rather than coming. Other neighbors claimed to have seen Innes on Earth after the passing of the full moon for that month, saying that he finally went away a week or so later. In this regard, the person who saw the object in the sky admitted to having seen an individual in and around the Innes estate, but did not think that individual was Arthur Innes himself. There was a resemblance, but he was sure that the person he saw after the night of the last full moon was not Innes. Dr. Joris revealed that one patient escaped from the sanitarium at around this time, and that all attempts to locate her failed. She was a young woman of a generally ethereal build, and had given indications of being under the prevalent flying delusion. In this regard, a friend of hers let me see some pages from a diary the girl kept. I managed to borrow them overnight and copied them down. Here they are. Perhaps not yet, even after these terrible months, for the power of Y is strong even though the moon waxes upon me. But I shall leap to the distant sanctuary where we build our fortress and wait the day of awakening and be with Kim again. Oh, the ecstasy, the indescribable delight. My whole being trembles at the remembrance of that night, when together we leaped above the rooftops and rode the 4 winds. How silly was I, little fool, to be afraid and think of wickedness, and the sin of witchcraft and the dread of burning. But that is the way of those of Y. Bitterly have I learned their ways, and I must wither here alone unless these heartless bars can move, and the moon beckon again. No, not to despair, but to feign submission, to give the lie and the denial, and walk the blind ways, so that they suspect not and suffer me to depart from this confinement. We are all learning to pretend and feign we do not remember after the call has come and gone unanswered. Sometimes I think it would be better if we could dissimulate, even when the rays beckon, but the ecstasy will not let us rest and we are helpless. Oh, Kim, are you safe, my darling? If only you could be with me and reassure me that R will not fail us. I must make one more attempt, one supreme effort to act, as they call normal, when the call comes, just long enough so that I may slip out into the courtyard. The Kim, whom this woman mentions, had disappeared a few months before her confinement in the sanitarium. It was thought that the loss of her lover was the primary cause of her breakdown. The final clipping was dated 1924. Surrealist film recalls weird mystery. Marseille, France, June 7. Jean Cocteau, author of the surrealist cinema Blood of a Poet, told reporters today that one sequence in the film had its basis in an unexplained mystery of some years back. In the film, the dreamer sees, through a keyhole, the macabre event of a child being taught to fly. A little girl is shown gliding up a wall and across a ceiling. This was based, says Cocteau, upon the strange case of Mimi Gervaux, the flying child of the circus. It was claimed by the showmen that the child, in her sensational flying act, was not supported by wires or any other artifice, and that it was necessary to weight her with heavy iron bells in order to attain the illusion of gliding over the top of the great tent. Cocteau tells of the time he visited Madame Gervaux to find her rehearsing with Mimi. He was struck, upon that occasion, he says, with the impression that the girl suffered from the confinement of the room and the restrictions of the act. Madame Gervaux mentioned something about Mimi's being permitted to fly free if she put on a good performance that week. It will be remembered that Mimi Gervaux and her mother left the circus at the end of the season, and that nothing has since been heard of either of them. The flying child of the circus was never fully explained, although a number of alleged expos have appeared in the more sensational journals. There have been many other such cases, continued Barr, over the course of the last 25 years, and they seem to have slowly been increasing. The event of July 4th, however, leads me to suspect that the power of R is nearing an apex, which will bring the hidden conflict out into an open struggle once more. Your studies should have made you well enough aware that we poor mortals are little more than pawns in this conflict, which is older than Earth or the galaxy we know. Although the latest discoveries anent the birth of our planet indicate that not only our world, but all the other planets, the Sun, and the visible stars were created at the same time, approximately 2 billion Earth years back. It is impossible to attach too much discovery to this conclusion on the part of such unimaginative people as stargazers, for it tends to show R is indeed gaining mastery, and some of the actual facts about the world and universe we know are beginning to filter through. Those who have studied the song could of course have saved these benighted plough horses much trouble, inasmuch as the fact of the simultaneous creation of all known worlds is not only given there, in its clearest possible form, but is also prevalent, in one form or another, in all the myths, folklore, and religions come down from the ancient days. And who is Prometheus but R? The day of wise power is not yet past. Perhaps it will last throughout the life period of Homo sapiens, but I am inclined to doubt it. Clearly the life force is the great interference factor which will eventually surpass and do away with Y, and we, as a highly advanced life form, may well play a prominent role in the final conflict. Chapter 3. Upon finishing the letter, I was torn between two desires. The first was immediately to sit down and write an answer, relating to Barr the full extent of my information, but a feeling of unease and unreality pervaded me, and though I tried several times, I found it impossible to write anything coherent, so I gave way to the conflicting desire and went out, aimlessly, into the street. It was a dampish, fog-ridden night, punctuated by rifts of spidery rain. The pavements gleamed in the wan effulgence of corner lamps. The smooth expanse of well-nigh deserted streets reached out lazily into the murky distance. Yet for all that, man and his works seemed very real and very close to me, and I was grateful. I strode by darkened shop windows, occasionally pausing to eye some display, stopping at stores to scrutinize their wares in the half-light. Smiling upon the cold hauteur of mannequins and the sardonic semi-leer of liquor shops. The buildings around me rose to unseeable heights, and occasionally a single rectangle of light peered down at me from invisibility. Now and then the whoosh of bus brakes, as the golden vehicles halted to discharge passengers, roused me from my penumbra. But this was very seldom, and I let the night and the fog and the wispy rain envelop me. Yet for all the dreamy aspect of it, my thoughts purred deep within my subconscious, from past experience. I knew what would come of this drifting. Suddenly a thought would come to me out of the deeps of my being with the clarity of a bell note on frosty air, and I would thus have arrived at a long thought-out conclusion. Yet thus it was not to be this night, for I found myself suddenly leaning against a window, my arteries pounding furiously at what I saw. An antique shop it was, a window filled with the loot of time, but what caught my eye was a large mawkishly framed painting with the title lettered boldly thereon. The Leapers. A strange and somber thing that painting was, a thing to set the mind and heart aflame, to fire the senses, saturate the nerves with half-glad horror. At the sight of it, when to my somewhat glazed eyes it clarified, I knew that here indeed I'd found a prize. There was a lake of molten fire, fraught with such colours I had never dreamed a living man could mix. A hellish lake, yet imbued with such livid realness that the eye was captured and drawn toward it. There were mountains that were the nightmare symbols of a creator gone mad. There were trees whose sinuous shapes no thing of cellulose could take. Yet these were but the fringes of the picture, the mad decorations, for even more outre was the centre. It showed a company of men and women, all glaringly nude, leaping from a nolly prominence, leaping up into the star-litten sky. A passion and a dreaming and an ecstasy was upon their faces, and a beauty which made the lurid ugliness of their surrounding thrice revolting. Up into the blue purity of the sky they leapt, casting no glance behind them, toward an orb of glowing gold that seemed to be reaching out to them. It was a full moon, swimming in an ether of fairy blue which wafted down to mingle with the drab hues of the atmosphere, hues which became ever more murky as it neared the ground. And the radiant leapers swarmed upward from a single point, diverging thence in a perpendicular thrust so that their flight was a representation of the letter R, and the tongues of the phosphorescent slime that licked forth from the surface of the nightmare lake, and the contours of the devilish mountains, and the abominable tentacles of the ghastly trees made symbols of the letter Y. Weak and trembling, I leaned against the glass, my fingers clawing for something upon which to hold. At length I regained enough composure to jot down the name and address of this shop, resolving to return the next day and purchase this painting. With difficulty I managed to flag a passing cab and give the driver instructions, then sank back into the cushions of it, spent and quivering. I do not know how I managed to get out of the cab and up the flights of stairs to my apartment, but manage it I did, and my last waking recollection was one of remembering that I had been able to discover no name signed to the masterpiece. The next day, I lost no time in tracking down the antique shop and obtaining the unknown masterpiece. In the light of day, it was garish enough, but only by artificial illumination did the full power of it come forth. The dealer was apparently only too well pleased to dispose of it, and my somewhat handsome offer, under the circumstances, made him eager to give me what information he could about it. It had come into his hands about 3 or 4 months before, and had lain undiscovered in a back room until his fiancée, apparently a highly superstitious person, had found it and urged its immediate destruction. This he had been loath to consummate, and he had managed to come to an agreement with the girl. He would display it in the window for a week, then if no one took it off his hands, consign it to the flames. Had I come a day later, he told me, I would not have found it. About the person from whom he had taken it, along with a number of other more orthodox paintings, he could tell me little. The man was not an artist, he believed. At least, he was not the person responsible for the leapers. Upon examination, he managed to find a name and address. I took it, thanking him with an extra bill, and made my way home, stopping en route to examine telephone books and directories. My search was fruitless, and after 3 days of intense labor, I had to admit failure. There was only one Harry Trevor I could find who had at any time resided on Joliet Place, and he had been killed in an auto accident some weeks before. I wrote to Barr that night, bemoaning my fate. His letter in reply, however, was decidedly cheering. You are exceedingly fortunate in having obtained the Leapers, inasmuch as I, and a good many others have sought it in vain for several years. The painter is one quite unknown to the world of art, a man named Carradine. Little is known of him save that he is now under a physician's care. He is known to have painted 4 large canvases, macabre to the point of madness: the Leapers, Seepage, the Lightning, and the Vanquished. It was upon his attempt to display this last that he was committed to the sanitarium. Only 2 people beside Carradine are ever supposed to have seen it. One of them is a medical student with whom I am acquainted, and he says that it cannot be described in words, that further, he is positive prolonged examination of it would crack the sanity of any man. He says that he himself underwent a nervous breakdown shortly after the experience of viewing, and was only restored to himself after prolonged treatment. Seepage and the Lightning, while extreme, are bearable, as is the Leapers. I have seen them myself. They are now in a private room at a museum here in Providence, and I could arrange to have them shown to you if you could make a trip up here, and I should very much like to see the Leapers sometime myself. At the moment my health is bothering me, and I cannot travel far from my gruel and my nostrums, but when this cursed winter is over, I may be able to drop in on you sometime. In the meantime, I'll describe these 2 for you as best I can. You have a flair for vivid description which I fear is not shared by me. However, I'll do the best I can. Seepage shows a village scene, numbers of men, women, and children in it. The colors are quite natural. The scene is normal except for the horror. An utterly hideous intrusion of viscous blackness, gobs and masses of it, apparently oozing through rifts in the sky. There is one cloud of purest white, from which the horrid stuff is also seeping. The masses are shown falling, some striking the earth. While 1 or 2 of the characters have become aware of the occurrence and are staring upward, their entire beings transfixed with horror. One young woman has been struck by a sort of splash from the grisly stuff, and she is screaming, her body contorted so that all the sweet young curves of her are shrieking lines of fear. It is not a thing for ordinary people to see. The Lightning is a night scene. It shows another group of townspeople gathered on a hill during what appears to be a storm. Only the clouds in the sky are fearful shapes, and great bolts of lightning are issuing upward from the ground, clearly attacking them. The faces of the people are strained, but courageous, showing anxiety as they watch this weird duel. One great lightning bolt is striking a cloud and dissolving it. The rain is falling on the village below. The humans are not touched by it. But wherever the rain is striking, the outlines of objects seem to be wavering and melting away. I believe the symbols of R and Y appear in this one. I shall see if I can find any trace of Stuart Carradine, but cannot offer bright hope of success. Before I could answer, a postcard came with the following note. Luck is with us. Carradine has been removed to, of all places, Fairview Sanitarium. You will remember the establishment mentioned in one of the clippings I sent you. He is still alive, and what is most important can be seen if the proper wires are pulled. I cannot make the trip myself. The sawbones now has me confined to bed, but if you are able to make the trip, I think it can be arranged. We'll drop you a note shortly as to details. Yes, luck was certainly with us, for there was more than what Barr had to tell, because I knew a Stuart Carradine at college, a quiet, aloof chap, rather averse to making acquaintances. But we had always gotten on well together, because of the community of our interests, and he was given to drawing highly imaginative and often terrifying sketches. He said that they represented dreams and memories he had. The last time I saw him, he had mentioned that he was going to try full painting in oils. Chapter 4. There was little difficulty in seeing Steward Carradine after all. A few matter-of-form questions to be answered. Then I was escorted to a rather large, comfortable room and left alone with the occupant. Apparently the man was not in a dangerous state. As he looked up, and a flash of recognition came into his eyes, I saw that he had changed very little. A bit grey about the temples, but otherwise the same, aloofly quiet person I had known years before. He arose and grasped my hand. Some instinct told me not to waste time with amenities. I eased myself into the chair he indicated, then came directly to the point. "I found the leapers," I stated simply. He nodded, a faintly hopeful expression around his mouth. "Did it mean anything to you?" "Much." I told him of the events of July 4th, and of what I had found since then. He nodded again, swept his hand across his brow in the gesture I had known in days agone. "I went too far," he said. "It was a mistake to show the vanquished. I knew well enough of the forces we face, yet in a moment of weakness and pride." His voice trailed off. "But tell me," he continued, "what is happening in the world? Tell me briefly, because you may not be permitted to talk to me long. When I came here, the forces of barbarism were sweeping everything before them." "No longer," I replied. "The armed might of those who would turn back the clock crumbles before a steadily growing opposition, even as I tell you of it." "Good. Then the time is not far off. You have studied something of it. When the barrier will be broken and Arkya can emerge." "Wait," I interrupted. "Tell me more. I know so little." "What of the leapers?" He bowed his head. "Martyrs, martyrs all. They must have all fallen by now. What desperate struggle these pitiful few waged out beyond the atmosphere against titanic odds can never be known. Surely none, or but a few at best, could have reached the citadel. Yet, believe me, they did not fall in vain, my friend. Even though their stand warned the enemy that the time approaches, they fell not vainly. When the time is come, and it may be soon, even within the period of our own lives, man shall leap beyond the barriers as never before, and shall play no paltry role in the final conflict. And when it is won, then shall we surpass even as the laws of the cosmos decree." He went to the desk in one corner. "I have not been idle here. They let me have a number of my personal books, and I managed to smuggle a copy of the song. I suppose it knows I have the volume, but it is prone to underestimate our strength. You see, I am not alone here. Remember the clipping? Yes, but I, an agent of Y, whether human or posing as human, I do not know as yet. In time, perhaps." "No," he anticipated my objection. "We are not being overheard. I said it underestimated us. It thinks that we can be subjected by the same methods that have been successful in the past. But let me read you a bit from the song. This passage, not very long, will clarify matters considerably, I think. And your friend can give further assistance after you go, for despite all that I said about its failings, I doubt that you would be permitted to see me again." "You mean something will happen to you?" "Perhaps that it will attempt to effect my natural decease shortly. I do not doubt, but I am prepared, much better prepared than it imagines." He rummaged in the desk a bit, then drew out a sheet of paper. "Here we are. Listen carefully." His words broke off as the door opened, and the gentleman who had been introduced to me as Dr. Joris stood in the portal, a faint smile upon his face. "No, my friend," he said. "I shall not forbid your listening to Mr. Carradine's work, nor to his reading it to you. In fact, I really owe you an apology for this intrusion. But bear with me, and let me say a few words before this continues." He took a cigarette from his case, lit it leisurely. "You are a highly imaginative person, sir. In a way, I admire you, partly because I am just a plodder, as it were, and even so socially desirable a profession as mine can become dull at times. When that occurs, I and my colleagues often find stimulation in the literary, artistic, or poetic works of such people as yourself. But I think you will agree that a stimulant can be overdone, can be carried to a point where it is no longer a man's valuable servant, but his master. That can only result in tragedy, tragedy such as I have often witnessed here. His words, calm, spoken with a sort of kindly assurance, fell like leaden weights upon my ears. I think it must have shone upon my face. He smiled again, sadly. If you would care to see me before you leave, I shall be happy to talk with you. I have often enjoyed your writings. He bowed slightly and started to withdraw. A moment, please, Dr. Joris, came Carradine's voice, somewhat strained but still calm. You will undoubtedly be interested to know that I have found the key to the Serpent Rune. Was I imagining, or did Joris start? I see that I have been a fool again, went on Carradine, but we mortals often are. You are indeed efficient. You have taken just the right approach to make my friend doubt me, make it impossible for my message to be effective. But you are at my mercy now. Will you withdraw, or shall I chant the rune? Joris fixed him with an icy stare. I am afraid it is you who are under my care, Mr. Carradine. You think I am bluffing? So be it then. And he began to speak, quickly in strange accents, in a tongue full of sounds I never imagined could come from a human throat. Joris stood stock still, but I noticed that his deft hand was making odd motions, and a chill was stealing into the room, an unreal chill. A coldness not of this earth. It seemed that the room was beginning to fade from my view, and that the two stood at grips with each other in empty space. Louder and more powerful grew the accents from Carradine's lips, and now Joris was indeed making gestures with his hands, and counter-accents were issuing from his lips. A roaring began to fill my ears, a roaring as of titanic winds screaming out of the depths of space. I shuddered as space around me rocked with thunderous discords until at last a shrilling that nearly burst my brain asunder threw me down. When I opened my eyes, Carradine was bending over me. Quick, he whispered. Brush yourself off before someone comes, and it is thought that I attacked you. But, Dr. Joris, I stammered, it is gone. No time to read you the statement now. Remember this number, 2475. In the Arkya chapter, Bar will help you, in case we do not meet again. Farewell. He gripped my hand. Go now, go quickly, but do not appear to be in haste. And if you see anything odd outside the room, don't investigate. I wish I had heeded Carradine's final warning. As it was, I managed to get out of the sanitarium without arousing undue attention, but once in the free air I fled madly, down the long hill to the railroad station, and boarded my train on the verge of collapse. No, I have not burned the book, nor have I told Carradine, who was released a few weeks later, of the object I saw in the corridor just outside his room. I have not dared to see him, nor have I told Bar of my intent, now that, with his aid, I have read the chapter and learned how to answer the call that comes across the night of space from the sanctuary of distant Luna. But I can no longer walk the ways of this world peacefully, since I saw that thing in the corridor, that empty shell, that replica of the human being, introduced to me as Dr. Alan Joris. When the call comes, I shall leap up into the sky and know the ecstasy of the leapers, even though it may mean frightful destruction at the hands of those that guard the barrier. And if I fall, what then? What then? Since I no more can live with men. Arkya, send out your rays that I may answer. End of The Leapers by Robert W. Lowndes as Carol Gray. The Long Wall by Robert W. Lowndes. Original version from Stirring Science Stories, March 1942, as by Wilfred Owen Morley, later reprinted as Settler's Wall. The original public domain version of this story has no mythos references but a later version. Retitled Settler's Walls briefly references the Necronomicon. Michael rolled down one of the front windows and knocked his pipe speculatively against the frame, sending little chips of faded blue paint flying. "Are you quite sure?" he remarked. "That we should have turned left at that sign?" "Wouldn't swear to it," mumbled Crosby. He sidled the car to a stop. "Let's rest a while, anyway. Roust out the maps and we'll take bearings after a sandwich or two." They emerged onto the tufty grass, shaking off muscle cramps of various sizes and shapes. No breath of air was stirring. Above them the sky was spotted with motionless clouds, minus birds of any kind. No scurrying animal life showed itself on any side. They masticated assorted sandwiches between yawns and let the sunlight drench them as it saw fit. Crosby shied a pebble across the well-packed road at the high wall gracing its other side. "Quite a thing, eh?" he ventured. "Yeah." The two examined the edifice at leisure. As far as they could see in either direction, it extended, unbroken, unmarked. 10 feet, all of that, it rose, dull and grey, the stone of it well weathered. There were no distinguishing signs, no places where grass, vines or trees eclipsed it. Behind them, and far ahead, it ran parallel to the sandy road until the far horizon swallowed it up. "Must be miles long," Crosby whispered, wondering why he dropped his voice. He paused as if to pick it up again. "When did we hit it?" "After we made the turn. Some time after. In fact," added Michael slowly, "I don't believe we came upon it until a moment or so before we stopped. I was looking at both sides of the road, and who could miss that? I didn't notice it until just before I asked you about the turn." Crosby turned and stared at the wall as if expecting the structure to explain itself. "It's odd," he stated. "A wall like this should be marked on the map. It should have some sort of reputation too, don't you think? Signs saying, 'You are now 10 miles from the famous Long Wall,' and so on. Who built it? Why should an immense thing like this be constructed out in the heart of the wilds? This territory doesn't look as if it's ever been settled. Maybe it was cleared once, but I'll bet that's all. We must be at least 30 miles from the nearest town." "More than that," Michael added. "Have you noticed how quiet it's been since we made that turn?" He strode over to the wall, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Look, Clyde, it seems to be made of just one piece. I can't find any sign of separate stones in it at all." The other joined him. "Where did it start?" "I don't remember, though I'd say offhand not more than half a mile back. Perhaps less." Crosby drew out his watch abstractly. 12:30. What say we take a little walk before going on? Half an hour's exercise. Good idea. I have a yen to hike around this affair. Look, you start down that way and I'll head on. We'll meet after a while and then try to figure out how big this thing is." Crosby ruffled his hair, a faraway look in his eyes. "It may be longer than we think. Then say we walk for 15 minutes, each following it in the opposite direction. At 12:45 we stop, and if the other isn't in sight, we turn around and come back to the car." Michael started briskly down the road, whistling thoughtfully between his teeth. There were a lot of things about all this that didn't fit in. First of all, it was 10 feet in height. Why? Perhaps there was nothing wrong with that. After all, he didn't know what the approved height of a wall might be, yet it did seem over-tall. Call that point 1 then, even if it might turn out to be okay. Point 2. How was it made? You could not figure out how it had been put together. He ran his hand over it. Yes, it felt like stone. But there was no sign of any breaks in it. No separate stones or mortar. No cavities. No appreciable irregularities. Very well then. Point 2. Composition. What was it that was odd about the top of it now? He let his eye run along its shelf. Nothing there, nothing at all. Ah, that was it. There was no sign of anything at all behind it. No house, trees, bushes or vines. Nothing leaning over. When they got back to the car, they must walk away from the wall until they could see what kind of land might be on that other side. Point 3, then, was upkeep. 4, obviously the gardener, or whoever it was, had to keep on his toes to prevent anything, vine or whatnot, from marring the unbroken, clean appearance of the wall. Was there a 4th point? Yes, there was. Life, or rather the absence of it. They hadn't seen a bird or small animal for how long? They hadn't been annoyed by insects of any kind during lunch, and Maine in this time of the year was swarming with insects of all varieties. No swamp draining of any kind was likely to prevail here. Of course, the fact that they didn't seem to be near water of any kind might account for the lack of mosquitoes. But there should have been flies, ants, grasshoppers, beetles, daddy-long-legs, and all manner of just bugs. He stopped to look around bewilderedly. Nothing but grass. A large expanse of open field lay to the right of him, blending finally into wooded hills near the horizon. To the left of him, the wall. He lit a cigarette and strode on, crumpling the empty package, tossing it against the base of the wall. At length, he saw something up ahead, on the other side of the road. As he approached, he made out the outlines of a car, parked over to one side. His 15 minutes were up, he noticed, as he flipped the butt away. Well, why not go the rest of the way to that car, see if the occupants knew anything more about the wall than he did? Perhaps they, too, were puzzled. Crosby was nowhere in sight, so the wall must certainly be longer than they expected. Someday, he thought, they must come back and make a thorough tour of it. His aplomb burst into shreds when he saw, upon coming closer, that it was their own roadster. How in hell could he possibly have gone around the wall, made a complete circuit? Damn it, he had been walking straight ahead, and there had been no sharp turns or slow curves. He was positive of that. Yet, here was their car, up ahead of him when it should have been behind. And there, by Jove, was Crosby, coming up from behind him with an equally amazed expression on his face. "Where did you come from?" demanded Crosby. Michael's stare was incredulous. "What happened? I hoofed it for 15 minutes, then started back, and all of a sudden, I see you up ahead of me. One instant there was nothing at all in front of me except the car. The next, I see you between me and the car." Michael gaped at him in silence for an instant, then turned, making a gesture with his hand. "Come on. We'll both try it. Get your watch out and keep your eye on it. What's the time now?" 12:50 to the tick. "Good. We'll see if this happens again, and if it does, exactly how long it takes." They strode on in silence, Michael taking out his pipe and stuffing it as they did so. One must not try to think this out now. One must observe. Observe carefully, meticulously. Would it happen again? The stillness about the place began to crawl under his skin, yet he didn't want to break it. There was nothing to be said at a time like this. He shuffled along the sandy road meditatively, started looking carefully at the base of the wall. Ah, there it was. "Keep an extra careful eye out now," he whispered. "If it's going to happen again, it will happen now, or rather, soon." "What's the time?" It was just 1:03 when we passed the empty cigarette package. Michael's eyes were fixed up ahead. There was nothing but empty road, reaching up to the rim of vision, and the expanse of hell to the right. Nothing, nothing, nothing. There. "Time," he gasped. "What's the time?" 1:08 exactly. He grasped Crosby's arm as they both halted. "Look up there." Almost at the horizon was a dark speck over to the right of the road. And what else was it? Why, the horizon was near. An average person can see a good many miles on a clear day, particularly on an almost flat terrain like this. Yet, he knew from past experience that their car, for that is what the speck was not more than a quarter-mile away. Thad Wing struck a match on his shoe and applied it to the oversized bowl of his corncob, surveying the two travelers as he did so. "What?" he asked. "Did you do when you found that you couldn't walk around the wall, Mr. Excuse me, I didn't rightly catch your last name." "Michael," he grinned. "I'm Jerry Michael, and this is Clyde Crosby." "Oh yes, pleased to meet you, Mr. Michael. And you, Mr. Crosby, would you be any relative of that fella who sings?" Crosby chuckled. "None at all." Wing nodded pleasantly. "Good thing," he commented. "Them crooners is all right so long as they remain a small tribe, but as I was saying, what did you fellas do when you found you couldn't get around that wall?" Next thing we did was to see if we could find out what was on the other side. We walked back into the field over by the side of the wall, until we could see over it. And what did you see? Michael looked downcast. Nothing. That is, nothing worth the effort. It was just an open field, running into wooded hills, exactly like the side we were standing on. We both felt disappointed, and I think we would have gone on if it hadn't been for something that happened accidentally. He turned to Crosby. Suppose you tell him, Clyde? It wasn't much of anything, said Crosby. I slipped on something and went down on my knees. When I got up, I looked to see what it was, and found a little colored rubber ball. The colors had pretty well faded, but there was a definite design to it. Well, I picked it up and threw it away, the way anyone would. I watched it, and I distinctly saw it go over the wall. Just about cleared it so that it should have fallen just a little bit on the other side. But when we got back to the car, my eye caught something across the road. I went over to it and picked it up. It was a rubber ball, the same rubber ball I had just seen go over the long wall. I might add, put in Michael, that I was watching the wall all the time as we walked back toward our car. If anything had come back over that wall, I would have seen it. That, continued Crosby, was just the start. I picked up the ball again and just tossed it over the wall. You saw me do that, didn't you, Jerry? Michael nodded. So I turned around, ready to get in the car, and there was that ball on the wrong side of the wall again. Crosby drank a glass of water hastily. I was about to throw it with all my strength this time, but Jerry stopped me. He suggested we take one of the paper plates we'd used for lunch and skim that over, then look for it on this side. Just to make sure, we marked it in blue pencil. I told Jerry to do it this time, so he hefted it over, and we both saw it sail neatly over the wall and out of sight. Then we turned around and started looking for it. We found it in less than 30 seconds. That made us both feel pretty sore. Either something pretty horrible was going on, or our senses were deceiving us, or someone was playing a joke on us. We decided to go over the wall ourselves. I'm smaller than Jerry, so I climbed up on his shoulders and pulled myself onto the top of the wall. I stood there for a moment, looking in all directions. It looked just the same over there, except that, of course, there was no car parked by the opposite side of the road. In fact, there was no road on the other side of the Avail. I balanced myself right, then made a jump, landing very nicely. And the first thing I saw when I straightened up was our car. A second later, Jerry was telling me I'd jumped over on the wrong side. Excuse me if I interrupt, Clyde, broke in Michael at this point. I was watching Crosby from the ground. He stood there, looking around him as he said, and his back was to me as he prepared himself and jumped. I clearly saw over the wall. Yet an instant later, I turned around, and there he was behind me, and I didn't hear any impact of his landing. I did, said Crosby. We tried it once or twice more, continued Michael. Then finally we quit, partly because we were disgusted, and partly because we were beginning to be scared. It frightened me, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. Wing knocked the ashes out of his pipe. I'll tell ye, he said slowly, what I can about that there wall, and it ain't very much now. That wall has been there for as long as I can remember, and as long as my father can remember, and it was there when his father came and settled the land here. This ain't a very old town, mister. I calculate it began to be settled not more'n a few years before my grandfather came here, after the War of the Rebellion. We all come from Connecticut, but that's beside the point. Anyway, you can see that the wall's been there for at least 100 years, and maybe lots more because they ain't nobody who knows anything about it before around the 1840s or late 30s when they first cleared the land in. These parts. I recall that my father told me about it and grandfather told him. They's lots of things, son, he said to me, which may seem peculiar to you, but so long as they ain't hurting you, don't you bother about them. Just leave 'em alone. And that's the way all of us around here look at that wall. It's there, and that's all there is to it. Ain't never hurt anyone yet, and it don't look as if it ever will unless some fool goes and bashes his head into it, and then it wouldn't be the wall's fault. People don't come on it very often, and when they do, most of the time they don't notice anything wrong with it, except that maybe they'll be sort of curious as to what it's doing way out here. So I ain't trying to tell you what you ought to do, Mr. Michael and Mr. Crosby, but since you asked me about it, I say forget about it and leave it alone. There's lots of things to fight against that are hurting people, and you don't need to find something inoffensive like a wall. Has anyone ever tried to do anything about it? Asked Crosby. No one, except in Ben Galen. He was the son of old Jim Galen. Well, it's no use to go into that, because you, being strangers, wouldn't know Jim Galen from Adam. He always was a bookish sort of lad. This was before my time, and he was determined to find out all about that there wall. He didn't. He went mad. I seen him monk myself, in the asylum, and it made me sick. So I'm repeating, you'll do well to forget about that wall. Will, began Crosby, if I didn't know you better, I'd call you a damn liar. Are you positive you couldn't see the wall once you got off the ground? Bentley nodded. There's no two ways about it, Clyde. That wall's the damnedest thing I ever came across. I fly over this way pretty regularly, and I thought there was something wrong when you called me up and told me about it. You couldn't help but notice a wall like that after a while. But the fact is, and it's just about as easy to believe as what you found from experimenting, that you can't see that wall from a plane. And I've flown pretty low over this part at times. You saw how low I was a few minutes ago. Michael nodded. Did you get the pictures? Sure did. We'll have them developed right off the bat. Well, said Michael, I guess we're ready. Got the flags, Clyde? Crosby nodded. Okay then, we'll go up and you set those 3 flags in a triangle. As soon as I spot them with the binoculars, we'll get into position. Then I'll jump. You'll see whether or not I come down behind the wall. Crosby fixed his helmet, climbed in, and waved. The autogyro sputtered a moment, then eased up gracefully as he watched. Quickly Michael set the 3 large red flags in a triangle and waited. There wasn't any wind this day, so it shouldn't be too difficult to make the jump right. It would be annoying if Crosby landed on the nearer side of the wall, but then they'd merely try again. Well, they had all day. They'd make it or know the reason why. He fixed his glasses on the autogyro. Ah. They were about ready, he thought. Bentley was hovering. There. There went Crosby, twisting and tumbling with a grin on his face as usual. For an instant he saw only a hurtling black speck. Then a great white mushroom sprouted out of it, and the abrupt fall was halted. Slowly, almost agonizingly slow, Crosby came down. It was clear now that he would land behind the wall. There could be no doubt of that. And if he couldn't get over, Will could always land behind the wall and fly him out. Michael cheered wildly as he saw the drifting shape float down on the other side of the wall out of sight, saw the white web of the parachute slowly hauled down. Then, with a sudden stab of premonition, he turned around and clutched at the nearest flag for support. Crosby was behind him. We found, summed up Michael, through careful experimentation, that we cannot go around the wall. You go for a certain distance, then you find yourself abruptly back where you started. We cannot go over the wall. You jump over and parachute down, and you find yourself on this same side, even though an observer can clearly see you go over. So, we're going to try to go through the wall. That seems to clarify matters well enough, commented Bentley. What about the pictures? Bentley made a wry face. Not one came out. Why not try, suggested Crosby, digging a hole under it and coming out the other side? I was going to suggest that, remarked Bentley. That's why I brought along these long-handled spaces. A wall like that shouldn't have a very deep foundation. Not so deep that you couldn't easily tunnel under it. Want to try it first? The others nodded. I've no desire, put in Michael, to mar this thing with blasts if I can possibly satisfy my curiosity any other way. The 3 picked up their tools and fell to. The ground, once broken, was not difficult for digging, and in about 3/4 of an hour they had a good-sized pit extending far under the wall. Bentley, who was in the lead, yelled suddenly, "Hey, I've broken through! Samir, and look!" The others gathered about him. There could be no doubt about it. They had broken into a tunnel similar to the one they were digging. A tiny patch of darkness lay ahead, beyond which a shaft of light could be seen. Eagerly they pressed forward, climbing up the other opening. Bentley began to laugh hysterically. For a moment they stood unbelieving, then realization struck them. They were back where they started. Their car waited on the other side of the road. "I'm all right now," insisted Bentley. "It just seemed so damned funny when I came out of the hole and saw it." "So now," asked Crosby, "we blast. Do you think it will do any good? Suppose we do blow a hole right through the damned wall? Won't we find, when we go through it, that we're right back here?" "We blast," said Michael quietly. He nodded to Bentley, who picked up a drill and held it firm while Crosby smote it heavily and accurately with the hammer. The reaction, they noted, was no more or less than what one would expect from ordinary fence stone. They took turns in holding the drill and swinging the hammers. "Okay," said Bentley quietly. "We're ready to blast." The others watched in silence as he prepared the dynamite and set the fuses. Then the three of them ran to a safe distance. The explosion was neither more nor less than they expected. "Reactions perfectly normal," stated Michael. He led the three over to the wall. A large section of it had been blown out, leaving a deep cavity. Fragments of stone were on all sides, and several large chunks they dragged out and threw aside. The wall now had a mark upon it, a hole of particularly dark darkness. Crosby poked a spade handle into it. "It's awfully deep," he ventured. "Got a flashlight?" asked Michael. "In the car." He returned after a moment, bearing a rope. "This doesn't make sense," he admitted, "but then neither does anything else about the wall, so I'm not taking chances. 3 pulls on this rope will mean I want you to help me back." Silently he fastened the rope around his waist, turned on the flashlight, and crawled into the hole. The others stared after him, trying to comprehend the peculiar blackness and apparent depth of the cavity. Numbly they watched the rope play its way out. Then came the 3 warning tugs. They started pulling until at last the familiar form of Michael came into sight. Yes, it was Michael. Only something in him had died, and they knew he would be like that for the rest of his days. When he spoke, it was in a sort of hushed whisper, and they didn't have to be told twice to start picking up the chunks of rock and shoving them in the cavity. The next day they came back with cement and made a finished job of sealing it. The only thing he would tell them was that he dropped the flashlight and it went out, but the light kept on going. He could see the shaft of light from the extinguished flash drifting slowly away into the unending blackness, a shaft of it etched against utter black. Somehow, they knew he was not telling all, that he would never tell all. Michael can be seen these days, and you'll find him normal enough if you can overlook a few eccentricities, and you aren't too sensitive. By the latter is meant, well, it's hard to explain. You either get it when you see him or you don't. But you must never turn out a light in his presence, and it is best to speak in reasonably loud, clear tones. He is likely to start screaming if you whisper, and sometimes he awakes in a cold sweat, gasping about a shaft of light drifting away into utter blackness, drifting away from its source, an extinguished hand lamp. And somewhere in Maine stands a long, high wall, marred only by a single spot where as can be seen. Someone tried to break through. End of The Long Wall by Robert A. W. Lowndes. The Mantle of Graag by Frederick Pohl, Henry Dockweiler, and Robert A. W. Lowndes. The Unique Magazine, October 1941. Not exactly the Hartley you expected to see, eh? I gasped. Staggered back. The thing I saw struck me like a swift blow to the solar plexus. I reeled for breath while something crawled and crawled up and down my neck. Then a myriad of voices shrilled inside my brain. It can't be! It can't be! It stood before me, trying to smile. It reached out with claw-like hands in the old gesture I had known. Then the hands fell away. The shrunken lips writhed, and the voice came to me as from a distance. I was dreaming. "It must be a nightmare. Come in, Harvey." I followed the thing that had been Frank Hartley into the hallway I knew so well, down to the quiet, luxurious room at one end of the apartment. Unchanged, quaintly carved furniture lay before me with its wealth of barbaric wrappings. Oriental rugs, tapestries, and exotic bric-a-brac. Over the fireplace, the full-length painting of Hartley, executed years back by an artist acquaintance. The mummy sank into Hartley's favorite chair, extended to me the familiar box of tobacco, a weird composition of blends mixed with incense. A concoction which effectively curtailed consumption save for a few choice friends who shared the mixer's exotic tastes. I struggled for composure, bluing the air with scented smoke. "Remember Roche, Harvey, Roche, Klarner, and Paulson?" "Yes," I muttered. "Of course. I've read enough of Roche and Klarner's OPI, seen Paulson's splendid drawings. Always intended to correspond with them, but never got around to it. You recall I asked you several times for their addresses. Where are they now?" "Dead," he croaked. "All dead. Paulson went first, then Klarner. Roche got tired of waiting for them and took poison. He always was more practical than the rest of us, if I were less of a fool." Silence. Then, "But you will want to know what happened. It all began when Hank invited Roche, Paulson, and myself up to his hunting lodge in Maine for an extended weekend. Paulson had just gotten his divorce and wanted something to take his mind off personal troubles. Roche was well enough ahead of the editors to take it easy for a while, and I decided I could do with a change. So we packed, climbed aboard Klarner's one-lung vintage of 20, and motored it to Maine. En route, Hank told us about the place he'd picked up for a ridiculously low figure. Nicely secluded, not more than a quarter-mile from the main highway. A glorified snake track through the woods, in other words, and a fairly traversable path running in. It was not far from a reasonably large, secluded lake, and there were several excellent beaches there replete with that special quality of white sand you find only in Maine. "I was in Maine just about that time," I interrupted. "Had no idea you were about. But go on." "Well, it turned out that Hank had obtained the place, but had never spent any time there. Just been around once or twice to see if all was in livable shape, then closed it up. So he was as unprepared as any of us for what happened. It's hard to describe. If I were writing one of my own weird tales, it would be simple. But this was different. No tangible signs of anything, of any kind. No wind howling, or the like. But something in that place got under our skin the very first night, and we couldn't shake it off. We didn't see, hear, or smell anything. No odd dreams. But it grew on us, grew so that we began looking around the corners, tapping the walls for hidden panels and the like. Hank said he wished Lovecraft could have spent some time there. He could have made a real description of the place, made his readers feel just as we felt, and work up to a terrific climax to boot. After the fourth night, we were just about to admit that it had us whipped. We felt damned sheepish feeling this way about nothing when we all spent most of our existence conjuring horrors on paper. But you can't fight nerves that won't lie still. The fifth night we had something of a storm. Lightning struck the chimney and tumbled a load of bricks down into the fireplace. It was when we were clearing out the mess the next morning that we found the book. His voice stopped. For a moment he sat staring into empty space. His skeletal frame twitched convulsively. "Strange," he whispered. "I can feel them, but there is no pain. No more pain. But I can feel them." "What is it, Frank?" He shuddered. "Wait, where was I? Oh yes, the book. It was a very ordinary-looking thing. Quite old yellowed pages, old print, completely in Latin. The former owner had scribbled a lot of notes in the fly-leaves. Partly translation, partly comments. Sometimes there were large question marks in reference to certain paragraphs, notations referring to certain pages in other books. The Necronomicon and Song of Yste principally. The trouble was that none of us read Latin very well, but from what we could make out it was definitely a book on the old lore, things that Roche, Klarna and I paraphrase in our stories. Oh, don't mistake me. It's not all Lovecraft's invention, you know. He changed a few names and added his own details. But the sources are genuine enough. We found a real treasure in a few closely written pages stuck near the back. They were by the nameless builder of this lodge, the owner of the book. There was reference to a grisly thing he had done some 20 years before. "Wait," I cried. "This lake of which you speak, was it shaped roughly like a hand with 5 inlets to correspond to fingers? Was there a huge rock on the beach a short distance from a large cave? Were you some 15 miles or so from a dilapidated little village popularly known as the Hamlet of the Dog?" "Yes," he answered. "How did you know?" "I've been there too," I replied. "I've been all around that district, seen the lodge, explored the cave and talked with an old fellow they call the captain. He tells a story of what happened there 20 years back." "Then you know of the treasure? Of Graag?" "Graag?" That was the name of the man. The wizard who built the lodge. It must have been his book you found. But I never heard of any treasure. The reference was in those written pages we found stuck in the book. There was a ritual to be performed. We really didn't believe a treasure would be found buried in the cave, but we thought there might be something of interest there, some base for a few horror tales. Roche talked us into going through with the ritual. We learned the signs and made the marks prescribed. Then we went out and dug in the spot mentioned by Graag. Nothing was found after a half hour, and we were just about to strike out for the lodge when Paulson's spade struck something metallic. He became very much disturbed at this, wanted to get away, but Roche insisted we unearth whatever it was. Paulson became increasingly nervous. He had read much more of the book than we, and began to mutter about something he called the other, the thing that Graag had called for his sorceries. But we smiled at this, and Roche forced the chest open with his pick. Hartley's lips trembled. It was a worm, a large white worm in the chest lying on silken padding. When Klarna touched it, the thing crumbled away into dust. We were puzzled, but Paulson was beside himself with terror. He muttered things about the scourge of the white worm and the Mantle of Graag. It was dark there. Just enough light came from our hand lamps to see what we were doing. Suddenly Paulson screamed out something and pointed behind us, toward the cave's mouth. We looked, saw nothing. Paulson went off his head at this and began to babble about a fourth figure and rave about the Mantle of Graag until Klarna quieted him with an uppercut. We carried him back and left the place the following morning. Paulson never recovered from the shock of what he thought he saw, died after about 2 weeks in delirium. Then one night I got a call from Klarna. The man was positively gibbering with terror. I couldn't make out what he said. Something again about the Mantle of Graag. Next day, a special delivery package came for me. It was the book, and with it, a long letter from Klarna. After I read that letter, I burned both it and the book never saw Klarna alive again. I'm glad of that. The letter told everything. About the other, what must be done when the sorcerer is about to die, and the other must be allowed to return. It tells of the rituals of burial of the worm, and the protective curse of the sorcerer over the earthly remains of the other, that curse that is known as the Mantle of the Sorcerer. And it told further of what happens to all who violate the remains, what happens to all who are present whether or not they take part in it. His voice raised in pitch. The worm, the worm. The Mantle of Graag fell on all of us, on Paulson, but he died from the sheer insane terror before they found him. On Klarna, he knew what the Mantle of Graag means. On Roche, he took poison before they could reach him. And on me. They have found me too. He rose quickly. Harvey, he whispered, get out quick before you see. It has come. They have made a place for it. Get out while you're still sane, and goodbye, Harvey. You won't see me again. He seized me, pushed me roughly into the hall. "Goodbye, Harvey. Now leave quickly." Something of the terror he felt flowed into my soul. I did not wait to inquire further. As my hand fell on the doorknob, I half turned, looked back. I wish to God I hadn't. I did not read the newspapers the next day, but I know they couldn't describe how Hartley was found. They dared not tell the truth. I knew because I saw. Later I verified his story. His words about the other, about the casting of the mantle, and the doom awaiting all present when the tomb of the other is violated. You see, Paulson was not mad when he screamed about a fourth figure, standing apart from the others, at the mouth of the cave that night. I was that figure. End of The Mantle of Graag by Frederick Pohl, Henry Dockweiler, and Robert W. Lowndes. This is the end of the story. Tell us what you think in the comment section. Please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release new content. If you want to support us, consider joining our channel membership. You will get instant early access to more than 100 stories before their release. This is the only way to support our channel.